The New York State Legislature, both houses, the Assembly and the Senate, have passed a budget for the 2024-2025 year, signed into law by Governor Kathy Hochul, and we've invited our colleagues from the New York State Legislature to come and talk about elements of the budget. We're joined today, and I'll bring him up to the microphone in just a second, we're joined by the Dean of the Assembly delegation, J. Gary Pretlow, who represents Mount Vernon and Yonkers. He's also have his colleagues along, Assemblywoman Amy Paulin, representing Scarsdale, Pelham, Eastchester, and the villages within White Plains, New Rochelle, and Part. Assemblyman Chris Burdick, who represents the northeastern quadrant of Westchester County, as well as the south as White Plains and Harrison. We have Assemblymember Mary Jane Shimsky, who represents the river towns, Greenburgh, Mount Pleasant, and the relative villages within, as well as a piece of Yonkers. We have Assemblywoman Dana Levenberg, who represents the northwestern corner of the county, Ossining, Croton, Cortland, Buchanan, Peekskill, and then up into Putnam County. We have with us New York State Senator Peter Harckham, who represents the northern portion of Westchester, a tier that covers from the Connecticut border to the Hudson River. And we may be joined by one of his colleagues as well, Senator Natalia Fernandez, who represents Pelham and a portion of New Rochelle, if she's able to be with us. Some other members of the delegation were not able to be with us, but we appreciate the work that Nader Sage of Yonkers has done, Steve Otis from Rye and the Sound Shore, and of course our great majority leader, Andrea Stewart-Cousins, who has done yeoman's work in managing the work of the Senate chamber. If I've missed any of our colleagues, many of whom I served with personally in the state legislature during my tenure up there, these are people who've worked very hard, and now they come back to give us an idea of what's happening in the state budget. And the state budget is an overarching document. It affects the towns, the villages, the cities, the school districts, the fire districts, the county government. All of us rely on the state for their decision making, and we're very happy that we have this talented group of public officials that represent us and the various people of this county. So let me start off in the leadoff position to invite Gary Pretlow to talk about his ideas. Gary is a longtime member of the Assembly, has served with great dignity for an extended period of time. As I mentioned, Mount Vernon and Yonkers. He heads, I believe, the Gaming and Wagering Committee in the Assembly. He's been one of the leaders on that and other issues. And Gary, you've seen a lot of budgets. Come on up and tell us about this budget. Assemblyman J. Gary Pretlow.
Okay.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you, Mr. County Executive, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, the budget was finally passed. The budget was passed 2 weeks late, but I think the product that we got 2 weeks late is 10 times better than what was originally presented to us. I'll only mention two of the issues. One was education. The original budget that was presented to the legislature cut over half of the school districts in the state of New York. The districts that I represent, Mount Vernon and Yonkers, were hit pretty hard. Mount Vernon was hit with a $3 million loss. That was $3 million less than they received last year, and Yonkers didn't rise. Through negotiations with the governor, the legislature finally got the governor to relent from what her plan was and to reinstall what's called a hold harmless, which means that no district will get less than they got the previous year. To that event, Mount Vernon didn't lose $3 million, but gained $2 million. And I believe Yonkers gained an additional $5 million. That was a good thing. And something more important to the citizens of Westchester is that for the first time in over 2 decades, we increased AIM, that's aid to municipalities, and that hasn't been increased in so long. And what we're doing now is giving all of our communities more revenue. What's one thing, though, that kind of upsets me is that I tried hard to get full licensure of the downstate casinos. That would have meant an additional influx of $1 billion to $1.5 billion this year in the state budget had that been approved. But for whatever the reasons are, the governor chose to put that off for another 2 years. So we're losing $1 billion that could be used toward revenue, could be used toward aid to localities. But all in all, I think the budget that we came up with is a lot better than it was. So I think, Assemblywoman Paulin, are you the next speaker here? And thank you very much, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Gary touched on school aid. Clearly, school aid and municipal aid, which he also mentioned AIM funding, matters so much because in Westchester, we have very high property tax bills. And so what the state can do is to ensure that they don't get higher. Because if we cut school aid, even in those districts that, especially cutting it in the middle, when there was no expectation, they would have had to either reduce services or increase property taxes, and the same thing with municipal aid. So that's very important. I want to talk a little bit about healthcare because that's my portfolio. I'm the health chair of the Assembly, and as such, just like in all areas, we were presented with a horrible first budget. The executive budget did something unprecedented that we had never seen. Clearly, I'd never seen it in all of my years in the Assembly. And that was to put in the budget $800 million worth of unallocated cuts. So she just said, okay, legislature, you come up with all of these cuts. She later reduced it to $600 million, but it's still an enormous amount of money. So where were we going to get that from? And how were we going to do that? So through negotiation, we were able to not only deal with the $600 million unallocated cuts, but we were also able to give modest income increases to nursing homes, something that under the prior governor had been really not treated well. Our nursing homes need a big boost in order to ensure their continuity. The hospitals, we think that, because it's mostly the Medicaid funding, so we think, okay, Medicaid, we don't have a lot of Medicaid, but which is not true. Medicaid, funding Medicaid means keeping healthcare whole for every single hospital. Because if you cut even a small amount from a very tight budget, you're hurting the institutions. And we certainly have some institutions that rely on Medicaid a lot more than others, so we're hurting them even more. So we were able to fight that back. We were able to do the entire budget and come back with no tax increase, which is very important, I know, to so many residents. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend and colleague, Chris Burdick, to fill in whatever he wants to fill in.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Mr. County Executive, for inviting us today. As Gary Pretlow had mentioned, our being late on the budget turned out to be the right move for us because it was a substantial improvement, as he mentioned, over the governor's budget. You're going to hear us all talk about education because it was going to hit every one of our districts. In my assembly district, every one of my school districts except one would have suffered a cut. And mention was made of the hold harmless provision. That provision had been in place for years and years and years. And so the proposed elimination of hold harmless came totally unexpected to the school districts, which at the time had been putting together their budgets. So we all were intent on restoring that. It was accomplished and enormously important to every one of our districts. There will be a study that will be done to look at the outdated formula. We all recognize it's outdated, and that would end up going into effect for the next fiscal year. I do want to talk a little bit about housing policy because here is something, a bright spot. There was a lot of wrangling, to be very candid about it, about housing policy over the last few years, centered around the 421A tax exemption in New York City, centered around tenant protection under the Good Cause Bill, centered around providing assistance or opportunities to property owners to improve their properties where units had become vacant and where they were telling us it was uneconomic for them to fix up vacant apartments. All of that was addressed. And like any compromise, not everybody got what they want. And I actually think that it was a good balance between tenant protections and landlord initiatives and incentives. And one of the key things that came out of this is that at long last, we actually have some incentives for outside of New York City. I was very pleased that on an opt-in basis, municipalities would be able to adopt a tax abatement program in order to incentivize affordable housing. And I am hopeful that that will promote the development of affordable housing. The last thing that I do want to talk about, which to me was a disappointment, was the Consumer-Directed Personal Assistance Program, which is a Medicaid program which provides for those who need long-term care, the elderly, those with disabilities, and so forth, to be able to hire their own home care workers. Well, there was a very significant change made in that it's now fiscally managed by what are called fiscal intermediaries. That's going to be collapsed into one statewide fiscal intermediary, and there's a lot of very understandable concern in the disability community, especially, that could result in a lapse or suspension or reduction in services. So we're going to follow this very closely to make sure that that doesn't occur. And so, but I would go back to what Gary Pretlow had mentioned, that we feel that on balance, this is a good budget, and I'm very pleased that we finally got it done. Thanks so much.
Thank you. That was Chris Burdick, Assemblyman, and now we invite Assemblywoman Mary Jane Shimsky, representing the river towns, to join us. Assemblywoman.
Thank you so much, Mr. County Executive, and good afternoon. One of the things you've heard running through everybody's talks here today is that this was a very difficult budget. And some of that is due to inflation. Some of that is due to increase in demand in certain state programs, whether it's mental health care, whether it's care for our senior citizens. Nursing homes, of course, came up. But perhaps the biggest variable is the ending of COVID aid from the federal government. We knew that at some point the day of reckoning was going to come, and it's basically here now. Now, one of the results of that day of reckoning is our infrastructure investment is not what we need to improve and upgrade an infrastructure which in many places is not doing very well at all. But what the legislature was able to do was hold the line on cuts so we could at least keep our infrastructure investments fairly consistent from last year to this year. And hopefully, as we settle into all of our new normals, we will finally be able to increase in infrastructure spending to the extent we need. Road and transportation infrastructure got a slight increase to $7.7 billion. One of the main areas was aid to fix local roads and bridges under the CHIPS program and the State Route New York program. Last year, the state legislature added $100 million to that program to help the local governments throughout the state fix their roads. That $100 increase was taken out of the executive budget with a fair amount of hard work during the negotiations. That $100 million was added back in for our local governments. The MTA is going to receive $7.9 billion in mass transit support. One of the most important additions there is perhaps one of the smallest amount of money, but it's going to mean a lot. $20 million for resiliency projects for Metro North Railroad's Hudson Line. There are studies that are showing that the Hudson Line is going to face regular flooding in numerous areas within the next couple of decades, if not within my lifetime, certainly within my children's. This $20 million will help keep us stable until the studies and the projects that we need to allow the Hudson Line to survive climate change and sea level rise are able to be put in place. In terms of environmental infrastructure, we have $500 million for clean water projects and $400 million for the New York State Environmental Protection Fund. That total of $900 million restored approximately $400 million in funding that was cut from the budget that the legislature received. We also have $1 billion in funding for the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, including a program to start planting up to 25 million trees in the next 8 years in this state. So we are doing our best with a relatively small amount of money at this point, but hopefully in coming years we will be able to build on those investments. We'll have an infrastructure and we will have environmental resiliency projects that are going to help improve the economic well-being and quality of life for all of our residents. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assemblywoman Mary Jane Shimsky. And Mary Jane, who served 12 years here in the Westchester County Legislature, had that a moniker of being the queen of infrastructure here in the county, so we're glad that you brought that up to the state. Next, we're going to hear from Assemblywoman Dana Levenberg. She's a former town supervisor, so she knows from the grassroots impact in running a town what these decisions mean, the AIM funding and other things. So, Assemblywoman Levenberg, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you, County Executive Latimer. And a lot of times when we're in a conference, we just say +1. I like to +1 all the wonderful things that all of my colleagues have already mentioned. Obviously, education, the environment, healthcare, some of the really big pieces that really make sure that we can keep our communities healthy and safe. That's what is at the core of the state budget. And I am so proud that we're able to put this forth with, again, more than $246 million in state funding for school districts in my district. But again, countywide, one of the things that was so important was that we were able to include in this budget funding to study the foundation aid formula, which, as we are looking at what the governor had proposed in her executive budget, we know that it was to try to figure out a way to make sure that the schools that are looking at increased enrollment and other challenges are able to get their piece of the pie that they need. So as we look at that hold harmless clause and why it was put in place, we know that we have to actually make sure also that school districts that are seeing some other needs emerge have a way to deal with that, looking at that foundation aid formula and trying to right size it for 20 years after it was originally introduced is so important. So there's $2 million to do that. Again, I just want to reiterate the $20 million for the resiliency project along the Metro North Hudson line, something that I've been fighting for. And we're going to continue, all of us together, to fight for the Region 8 funding for our roads. We know how important it was to restore the funding for CHIPS and to restore the funding for all of the clean water infrastructure programs and everything else. But we're also really seeing that climate change is impacting our roads like never before. And we have to figure out a way to address the roads and the needs in our district, in our, Region 8, which is the Department of Transportation region that we are in here in Westchester County. I'm also so happy that we were able to restore $7.5 million for the Hudson River Estuary Management Program that helps our communities protect and revitalize the river and surrounding areas. And also something that I'd heard about from libraries and school districts, that as we're looking to transition to electric buses, which is challenging, that every school district shouldn't have to fight this fight alone. And we put money in the budget for a new zero-emission school bus resource center within NYSERDA to really help school districts manage that process. I was disappointed that we were not able to get the New York Heat Act passed, but the governor has committed to making sure that we do address that. outside the budget this session, and I know that it was in the governor's proposal, as in it was in the Senate proposal, and we're really having to work hard also with the Assembly to make sure that we do it right. So we want to make sure that we get it right, and hopefully we can get that done as promised by the end of our session. Also, again, we know that the CDPAP and making sure that that we're getting the money to the people who need it most, and that's what I think we were trying to do with the change to the fiscal intermediary. I'm hoping again that we're going to monitor that very closely in the legislature and make sure that we're doing everything we can to get the money to the people who need it most and the people who are doing those really, really tough jobs. And then we did include a 1.7% increase for cost of living that added to the 1.5% increase in the base pay for our human service providers, which is so important. And finally, we know that our local newspapers are really struggling, and that's where so many of us really get our local news and understand what is happening in our municipalities. And we were able to include the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, of which I'm a co-sponsor, to help protect our local news industry in the state budget. Somebody said to me that they don't know who's even died in their community because they aren't able to read those obituaries. So making sure that we're providing those tax incentives for our local news organizations is so important. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my next colleague, actually, County Executive, who will introduce them. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Assemblywoman Dana Levenberg. And I do want to mention that the Assembly delegation, our delegation leader, Gary Pretlow, longtime member Amy Paulin, and their colleagues, we're happy to have them here. They're going to be holding meetings in their local communities to discuss this in greater detail. They're presenting to various organizations, local village governments, and so forth. So look for those opportunities where you can sit and have more extended dialogue in your home communities with each of them. We want to thank Assembly Speaker Carl Hastie for his leadership overall in the chamber and delivering the Assembly side of all of this. And I do want to recognize again those Assembly members who were not able to be with us today: Steve Otis, Nader Sage, and also Matt Slater, who also represent Westchester in the Assembly. In the New York State Senate, I've aforementioned that led by Andrea Stewart-Cousins, we have two members of the State Senate with us here today to talk a little bit about things. I've had the privilege of serving in both houses, and they are different, the way they're structured, the way they each operate. And in order to have something accomplished, both houses have to be ultimately at the same place, and they get there a bit differently. But nonetheless, it's leadership in both houses that get us to the finish line. So first up, Senator Pete Harckham. Pete, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Mr. County Executive. Good to be with all of you. Great to see my former colleague, Jim Maizano, doing a terrific job with Consumer Affairs. Great to see you. My colleagues have said a lot. I have a friend who says when you go near the end, everything's been said, except not by me. But I'm going to try not to touch on some of those things. I will say, as chair of the Environmental Conservation Committee, front and center in my work was restoring the $250 million cut to the Clean Water Infrastructure Program that Assemblymember Shimsky mentioned. And I want to thank members of organized labor, the environmental community, and municipal leaders. That is such an important program that was started 5 years ago, $500 million a year. It's not enough. We know we have a $60 billion backlog of projects in New York State, but it was a predictable source of revenue that our municipalities could apply for. Good paying union jobs were created by this work right in our local communities. And so that when that cut came out, that was pretty shocking. And I want to thank everybody for rallying around that. Mary Jane also mentioned the Environmental Protection Fund. That was a $25 million cut as well. Governors have tried to do that in the past, raid that for salaries. So again, thank you everybody for rallying behind that. A lot has been said, so I'm not going to talk about what colleagues have said. I want to talk a little bit about the delegation. So people are at home who are watching this. You need to know that everyone you've heard from, my colleague Senator Mayer chairs the Education Committee, who you'll hear from shortly, all our colleagues in the Assembly, we work together incredibly closely and incredibly well for the people of Westchester. Before I came over here, I was over at United Way, and they were saying thank you that we restored the $2.4 million for 211. That was something that was a priority for every member who is speaking here today and for the members who are not here. 211 is a vital resource for the people of Westchester and all over New York State. Food insecurity, backlog on utility bills, housing issues, so many areas where they can get help through 211. That money was cut out of the budget. The delegation rallied around. Another one is the Parkway Police, who work with the county executive and his team. The Westchester County Police, so incredibly patrol state parkways, and there's a cost to that. And the governor cut that money out, $3 million. Every member of the delegation rallied around that. And you can point to things like eviction and prevention money that we put in for Westchester residents. So the message that I have today for folks is that you heard the fight we had in the budget to get back to a place that was reasonable, but it was accomplished only because we were all focused and working in unison. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Mr. County Executive. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's Senator Pete Harckham. Next, we're joined by a good friend of mine, Senator Shelley Mayer. She represents the eastern quadrant of Westchester County in the New York State Senate. She's a former member of the State Assembly as well, so she's had the experience in both houses. She heads the Education Committee in the State Senate, so much of the emphasis on funding the various school things came from her initiative and her hard work. Senator Shelley Mayer. Senator, thanks for being here.
Thank you, appreciate it. And I'm glad I can be the closer here, because I think everyone talked about education, and really this was a collective effort by both the Assembly and the Senate on a bipartisan basis, and I want to give credit to our superintendents, PTAs, boards of education, parents, and everyone else who rallied. We were all on the same side to push back against the governor's cuts, which, as mentioned, half the school districts in the state would have had a literal cut in how much they were getting in school aid, and others were going to get significantly less than they anticipated in planning their budget for next year. And we were able to get rid of the first part of the governor's proposal. We were able to modify the second part and get a higher level of inflation than the governor proposed, which was a problem. And the third thing was that we were able to get this study of foundation aid. Why is that important? The formula was created in 2007 after the famous CFE case. And the point is, many of the metrics in that formula are out of date. 2000 census data, a regional cost index that pairs Westchester with upstate instead of with Long Island and New York City. So there's many things about it that are not currently adequate to determine how much a school actually needs. English language learners, we have far greater percentage in every school district. Special needs, we have a significant increase in the number of special needs and a more complex special needs being seen by our schools. So it was a collective effort. We did not have 100% victory, as you never do, but we had a very substantial victory, which will give our schools the opportunity to revisit how they spend money. They lost their federal money. Now they have to move ahead, and we've given them a bit of a ramp in order to move to the next stage, where we have to actually determine what schools need and make sure they have the most possible. The second thing I want to mention, I don't believe it was raised, is the changes we made in retail theft, something I feel strongly about. Many people in our community are upset about sort of the brazenness of certain people in basically stealing, and I don't mean the old kind of shoplifting, I mean the new kind of shoplifting. So petty larceny is up to $1,000. So if you take $900 worth out of a store, you're charged with a very low-level misdemeanor. We did a number of things to address this, and they came in large part from conversations with law enforcement, conversations with the DA, conversations with small business. One, we created the crime of assaulting a retail worker. Two, we did something which I have been working on, which is to allow aggregation, adding together the amount of value of a petty larceny and another petty larceny to be grand larceny, so you can charge a more severe crime on the second offense of which is bail eligible. Third, we created a fund to help small businesses with the costs of security. And four, we created the crime of basically selling the products that you stole on the internet. These all deal with, regardless of how extensive this problem is in Westchester, far less than in other places, the perception and the fear about it colors all of our communities. And it's something that I felt strongly about. Last part, just because it involves the village of Mamaroneck, and Steve Otis is not here, Steve and I were able to get another $10.9 million to finally get to the end of the funding for the Army Corps of Engineers flooding project in the village of Mamaroneck. The county has been a fantastic partner every step of the way, as have our senators, particularly Senator Schumer. But now we have enough money to sign the deal, hopefully, keep your fingers crossed, and start the work to finally get this 10-year-old project underway for the village of Mamaroneck. So thank you, County Executive, for your leadership and for your team. And we had a budget that really reflects the values of New Yorkers, again, as a product of compromise. All budgets are compromised, but at the end of the day, we fought hard and we did quite well at the end of the day for our communities. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Shelley Mayer. And again, let me express my appreciation for the rest of our delegation, which includes the State Senate Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins, Senator Natalia Fernandez, and also Senator Jamal Bailey, who represents Mount Vernon within our delegation. Just as we close off this portion of it, my colleagues who are here today to each talk about elements of the state budget show you what it is to be a legislator, what it is to be engaged in public policy. Much of what they talked about has substance attached to it. It may not always be exciting to understand. It may not get eyeball clicks in the way that they should, but it's important, and you should know about it. You should be able to see each of them speak about the things that they care about. We send them to Albany. We ask them to be engaged in substantive issues, and we know that it has an impact on our lives, even if we don't always make those correlations and connections. And I think it's important that each of them have their voice heard, and that we understand this is what we expect out of an elected official. There's many times that we might be present at an event to give a proclamation at a ceremonial event or to talk about things that matter to us in the society at large. But the guts of being a legislator is what you've heard right now. The New York State budget is the single most important act that happens during the legislative session. It has the weight and power not merely as a fiscal document, but as a policy document where the governor lays out not just how that money is to be used, but how it is to be used, what policies are implemented. So I think seeing the depth and the breadth of the knowledge of our colleagues who represent us in the State Assembly and the State Senate is very important to see. It's important to us as a county government, as government officials, but it's also important to us as citizens. Because if we're going to argue for democracy, this is what democracy looks like. This is what the substance of democracy looks like. And I want to thank all of my colleagues for being here to share their thoughts in detail. And again, I invite you to follow. They're going to be communicating with you with e-newsletters and other fashions when they offer to come to a coffee and conversation or a town hall type meeting. Take them up on the offer. Meet them at the local firehouse. Meet them in the local library. Meet them wherever they choose to set up these meetings and have an opportunity to hear more about them, ask questions. They're all very accessible, and I consider them not merely just colleagues, but friends. Thank you for being here today.